Okay, it's Wednesday, May 21st, if I'm correct, and this is the 12th and final episode of the spring Fireside Football podcast. It's been fun to have some pretty dynamic guests, I think, over the last 12 weeks, share their thoughts, their journey, everything that goes on. And today I'm pivoting because there's nothing new in NFL now that we have the schedule. All the data points have been pushed in there. I've got everything written. I don't have to worry about the NFL for 3 more months, which is nice. But now, unfortunately, as we'll find out, you have to start worrying about college really quickly. So this show is all about college. My special guest today came to my attention, I'd say about 10 months ago when I was just randomly researching some stuff, because I like to see what's out there, what the buzz is, when do I need to put in a play, when not do I need to put in a play. And then all of a sudden, Step on a Duck, didn't know his first name at the time, has all this thing and he lists his plays and he's got 16 or so unders and no overs. And I'm going, oh my goodness, is this a clone of me or something like that? You know, what's going on here? Somebody understands the layout of what you need to do. And then a month later, all of a sudden, we're on a podcast together with Kyle, and we're talking about Group of Five and so on. I said, well, I saw his stuff. Now I'm going to be on a podcast with him. I can hear his thought process. And I can tell you that it greatly pleases me that we've connected a little bit, not necessarily live, but in spaces and other stuff, where I could see that there's a new generation of sports handicappers that understand that you don't cut corners in this business, that you understand that if you put in the work and you analyze your results and you know what your strengths and weaknesses are, you can have an edge, whatever it is, NFL, college, totals, anything that you do. So this is a scary NCAA football landscape, and I think I've got the guest right now that understands that landscape. So with all that, Joshua, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Doing really well, Ron. Thank you very much for that resounding introduction. Sincerely appreciate that, and I've loved our collaboration over the last 12 months. It's been wonderful to put two sharp regular season win-focused minds together, and really appreciated your process and all of the preparatory work that you do in the off-season as well. We are just 92 short days away from kickoff, and we now have a regular season win total posted for all 136 FBS teams. So it's really an exciting time in the off-season prep stages for us to deep dive into these teams, into the schedules, and trying to get a feel for what these teams are going to look like on the field, where the coaching changes and coordinator changes are going to affect certain teams, and then really deep diving and analyzing the schedules to try to find value in our regular season wins, which is one of my favorite derivative markets to wager on, and I know you love it as well.
Yeah, I have separate bank rolls for futures as opposed to regular season. I strongly endorse it. We may or may not get into that. That's a different subject. But really, the place to start is how you started, because people want to know about your journey and how you got to this point where I think you're just going to make a rapid rise in terms of your visibility in the industry. So how did it start for you, and what got you interested into the handicapping of the college especially?
It's a great question. It's a dynamic question. Not really a dynamic answer, but I've loved college football ever since I was a youngster, 7 or 8 years old. Flipped the TV on Saturdays. Back that time, you only had about 2 or 3 games on that were nationally televised, and if you didn't have premium pay-per-view packages, you weren't getting much more than that. But I loved everything about the pageantry of the sport. You had a mosaic of different offensive and defensive schemes. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance surrounding the games, and I just really gravitated to the college leagues from a young age, and to this day, it has never wavered from that. After I graduated from high school, I went to college, and I played college football at the FCS level, and after that time was over, I could not wait to just continue to deep dive into the sport that I understand and that I love. I was just so fascinated when I was introduced to betting on the sport itself. And it took a little bit of time for me kind of cutting my teeth and really learning the art of wagering on college football. But for the last 10 or 12 years, it's been something I have done really successfully, taken it very seriously with the off-season prep and with the grind. And I'm here to tell you there is no cutting corners in this business when you have to focus on 136 teams annually, and they're adding more and more every year with FCS teams moving up. That work really, you can see a lot of fruit of the labor, and you can see a lot of that pay off. So I have just loved college football as a fan and now as a bettor for the better part of 18 years. I really started doing it in 2008. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but when you
Yeah.
my goodness, when you do the number on it, yeah, this is my 18th year of betting on college football, and time has gone just like that.
Well, the whole sports industry has changed from before 2008, after 2008, and especially, as you know, because it's moving. I mean, it's a moving target right now, especially once we had the COVID years and people were playing Big Ten starting in October, Pac-12 barely playing enough games, different rules in 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 different leagues, and you had information that was rightly because of health reasons not divulged to the public, and all of a sudden you didn't know who was playing and who wasn't, and all that has led to this wild west scene of, okay, we're opening the door, you could transfer here, you could do that. It's really become a business. You can pay them this, you could poach here. So the next few questions are really going to talk about how you and it took 2020, so you've already had 10, 12 years going into it. So you were equipped, you had a foundation, but then you had to shift that foundation maybe just a little bit. So, for example, realignment. Colorado, Arizona State, they flipped their roster 2 years in a row. You couldn't even recognize their roster from one year to the next. 10 schools lead the Pac-12 and just become nomads in other leagues. Oklahoma and Texas led the way as well. Talk about that and what were your takeaways from that, and how did you feel about that in terms of a handicapping perspective right away?
Conference realignment and the transfer portal have had the greatest impact on wagering on college football, I think, than really anything else. Even legalization, it's been so difficult to try to get a grasp since the transfer portal rules have opened up. Now we're seeing 3,900 players annually that are transferring. Well, that's 35 per team. And so it's really hard to really get to see a team and their maturation from year to year. Oftentimes, and we were just talking about this off air, teams would have used to take on a persona and an identity from the longevity of their coaching staff and players that have been there for 3 or 4 years, more type of legacy players. We just do not see that anymore. You'll see players that'll transfer 3 or 4 times over the course of their career rather than stick it out with one school. Not in favor of that, but that's where we are. Conference realignment and the expanded super conferences and the truncation of the Pac-12 has also been an interesting twofold with the landscape, because now you have 16-team super conferences and you have many teams that will experience an unbalanced schedule as you're only playing 8 or 9 conference games. And so that can really affect a team, good or bad. It can affect a good team, good or bad. It can affect a bad team in a similar fashion, really depending on the strength of schedule and the strength of record of perceived record of the opponents that they're playing in schedule. And there's no bigger market that affects than regular season wins, which we'll get into in really deep diving and analyzing the power and strength of a team's conference schedule relative to the regular season win number. But to answer your question in a short fashion, it's had a drastic impact. It's had an impact on my preparation time. It's caused me to have to really deep dive the rosters, the coaching and coordinator changes, and try to get a finger on what these teams are going to look like on the field. And that sort of process is much more labor intensive and requires me to start earlier and earlier every season.
So we had roughly 29 coaching changes this year, and that's just head coach. And I know from listening to you on other podcasts and my own work is that coach is one thing, but coordinators are really important too. You have to decide whether or not the new coordinator is better or worse than the old coordinator. What kind of scheme are they going to run? What's their track record here, there, and whatever. And I always call it 3 coordinators because I also do a deep dive into the special team coordinators as well. So because it's a business and you don't get the Frank Beamer approach anymore. Back when he could have been fired, he would have been fired in this day and age after 2 or 3 years. Instead, he lasts 29 or so years, or close to that, in the business. How do you deal with this frequent change, and what does your study look like in terms of head coach and coordinator?
Well, the frequent change really just requires you to keep tabs on the transfer portal. There are websites out there that will keep tabs on the transfer portal at large and overall. And then there are also sites out there that are trying to help with putting out a de facto 2 deep so you can kind of shore up where teams are at. Really, that preparation will continue deeper into the offseason and as we get into fall camp, because you'll find that teams have position battles at all 3 levels of the defense. You'll find that they're trying to shake out things on the offensive line. The offensive line is the heartbeat of the offense. If there's no continuity on the offensive line and that's not humming on all cylinders, it becomes very difficult to move the football and have success scoring points. So shoring up the offensive line, where are people at in the skill position groups? I mean, it's so easy to see those headline players that enter the transfer portal and they get plucked right away. Teams also now have the responsibility of backfilling those positions to try to replicate some sort of production at those positions. It's becoming harder and harder. What's really also interesting is that it's really becoming harder and harder for the FCS division and also for the G5 level, as those teams are just continuing to get poached year in and year out. And you can look all over America at the G5, and teams are just being decimated by the portal. If you have a standout player or two and they have a successful season, they are gone. And they're going to the Power 4 level. They're trying to get an NIL deal and make some money. And then you have these G5 teams that are trying to replace with fringe players and FCS talent. And so the overall talent in totality of the team drops, and the gap between the G5 and the Power 4 just continues to get wider and wider.
Yeah, absolutely. How does this, I got to tell you, in past seasons, I would have a number of plays, some strong in week 1, because I've been setting power ratings for 40 some years. And I have right away I have opinions, although now those power ratings are etched in pencil more than pen, because you don't know how the roster is going to gel week 1. But I would have some strong plays week 1. And it seems like the last couple of years, there's not the same volume of plays. How do you approach week 1 with everything that's been going on?
Well, I approach it very similar in nature to how I'm also approaching regular season wins. I'm proceeding cautiously. I'm still doing the abundance of research, but I'm not as quick to fire away because of the ability for teams to continue to shuffle throughout the summer. And I really want to get a fingerprint on what these teams are going to be. But what I think is going to happen specifically this year with this wider gap is I think you're going to see one of 2 things. You're going to see spreads that can't be set high enough, and so you might see chalk in weeks 1 through 3. It used to be the old adage anyway in college football that chalk was always supreme, or that was the perception. It wasn't always true, but I think this year you might see some mismatches between group of 5 teams and Power 4 teams, and those spreads just are not set high enough. The other thing that I think is real unique is you'll have to assess how teams are implementing load management. You see it all the time with the scheduling rhythm in the SEC and the ACC, where these teams are going to schedule FCS foes or lower ranked group of 5 foes the second to last week of the season before rivalry week. You'll always see spreads that are minus 45.5 or so. And more often than not, teams just aren't even interested in covering those big numbers. They'll secure a lead by 3 or 4 touchdowns, completely be in control of the game, but they'll use those spots for load management and use those games to get everybody into the game and just get out of there healthy and with a win. And so it'll be real interesting to see how that plays out with load management. We saw it last year a bit too with the expanded 12-team playoff. And the reason why is you had fewer and fewer teams that had to necessarily petition to try to get into just a 4-team playoff, and you didn't have teams having to be perfect at 12-0 in order to get there. So load management was key, and I think it's something to keep an eye on this year as well.
And the flip side to that, I would argue, is that instead of maybe 7 or 8 teams in November having a realistic chance to be in the Final Four, and that's it, and everybody else is out, now you might have, like you said, 5 or 6 teams that do not need to be perfect. But then you could go back to the 20th or 21st team or something like that. All it takes is a Big 12 team to get into their own playoff berth, and then all of a sudden they're one game away from making the 12-team playoff. So you've got all these teams fighting for the last eight or so spots in the playoffs. They may run up scores during the season, which is not something I'm fond of because it leads to injuries and other stuff, but maybe more favorites in the middle of the season.
Yeah, that's distinctly possible. I'm going to have to really assess and analyze how that looks this season. Certainly something to chart. I can't necessarily speak on exactly what I think is going to happen there, but I definitely think that's a possibility to keep an eye on in the middle portion of the schedule.
And one other point I want to kind of run by you is you got these 17 and 18 team conferences, which is ridiculous. But besides that, University of Minnesota, very nice coach in PJ Fleck. They tend to achieve expectations or exceed expectations. But what's the ceiling now in an 18-team league when you're dealing with Ohio State getting any athlete that they want, Michigan getting any athlete that they want, Oregon paying for any athlete that they want, and so on and so forth, USC? Is the ceiling like 7th place in the conference, never to fight for a Big 10 championship again? And what happens if the season is disappointing and they have nothing to play for in weeks 10, 11, and 12? I really think we're going to see opportunities to fade some teams in the middle of the year who do not meet expectations. What do they care if they finish 9th or 13th in the league?
I think that's really important that you touched on that. I will just quickly say, I think that they may not admit it, but teams like Cal and Stanford, USC, UCLA, Maryland, teams that joined these 16-team super conferences have to be experiencing buyer's remorse. There's no way they can be happy with these programs that are buried in irrelevancy. And you hit it right on the head. Some of these programs, the absolute ceiling is going to be 7th or 8th in the league, and that's not going to really get you where you want to go as a program. I do think that you have to identify as a bettor the fact that teams do take on this sort of mental complexion throughout the season. The 12-game season is taxing on your body anyway, physically playing football, 12 games in a 14-week schedule. But then you add in the cross-country travel that these super conferences have required, and oftentimes teams will travel long distances 3 or 4 times. I'll tell you what, man, when I go on vacation for a week and I come home, I'm tired.
Yeah.
And that sort of travel and preparation really can tax your physical nature, but it also really wears on you mentally. And some of these teams, especially when you see it in the regular season win analysis with schedules, there's just spots where they just don't have anything left in the tank.
Yeah.
And so they exhale when they shouldn't, and they catch a team that's not exhaling. And that's where you can find some sneaky upsets and flip a regular season win, which makes all the difference. But I totally agree with you. You're going to find teams that just don't have a ton to play for in the last 3 weeks of the season. So what are they doing? Are they building for next year? Or they have 8 to 12 players that are checked out, and so now they're rotating in some young guys? Well, that doesn't necessarily bode well all the time.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you're talking about that is they preserve red shirts now. If they play 4 games, they're not going to put them in for the 5th game. If all of a sudden this team was expected to compete for the 12-team playoff or at least be in the divisional race, and they're 5-5, these guys are going to say, no, I'm looking at other opportunities, or no, this isn't exciting that I'm now flying to Rutgers to play my next game or something like that. And it's a shame, but I wish all these schools that went into this realignment, nothing but the worst. But that's a personal opinion there. I think you've mentioned before, and you even hinted at in this podcast, that you're starting work a little earlier. And you mentioned February, and that's scary because it's not that everybody has to start in February. We don't want to say that, hey, we're doing this podcast toward the end of May and you've already missed the boat? No, because then I would miss it too, because it was always easy for me to start in July 4th, spend 5 straight weeks on what I needed to do because I have a database of everything, and be ready by August 15th. I'm shooting off win totals as we go, but I mean completely ready for the season by August 15th and be ahead of the curve because I handicapped each game twice, once from one team's perspective and once from the other. But now I feel a little bit behind. So talk about that process of all the work you have to do just to get ready before the season.
Well, there's a couple of things at play. We've had 3,900 players enter the transfer portal, and so that creates 3,900 data points worth of work that have to be analyzed. And so I, without having that, was able to start my off-season prep work sometime in April when spring games were firing up. But I've really had to ramp that back and kind of see some compression after the Super Bowl with that because of the sheer volume of transfers. And you really just cannot assume that a team is going to take on a similar identity to what they had in 2024 in 2025 when they have 38 new players. It just doesn't work that way anymore. So I spend some time in late February and early March really trying to dive in and get a handle on what's happened in the transfer portal. But spring practice has not yet commenced, and then there's still a second portal window. So the bulk of my work does start in April without question. It's really unfortunate what teams have done with spring games up to this point, because I used to be able to use the spring games as kind of a cheat sheet, right? I would sit down, there was about 40 or 50 spring games that were televised nationally. It was just myself and the spiral bound notebook and pencil. I could take notes. I could recall what I saw in a competitive environment that mimicked football. And now what's happened is these games are not on television because coaches do not want their players poached. And they're also changing the outlook of the actual competition itself, and the spring game rarely even resembles a football game anymore, which really kind of makes it obsolete. So it's really unfortunate there that you've had to see that go away. It's caused me to have to pivot in my off-season prep. Just because I have a rhythm for what I do about the third week of February through first couple days of March, really deep diving in that first wave, it does not mean that people would be behind. But I will say there's a very famous football publication considered the Bible of college football that comes out on newsstands at Barnes & Noble on the 4th of July. And if you've done nothing until that time, you might find yourself really squeezing to try to get it all in. So I would recommend, if you're not going to start in April, maybe not wait till the 4th of July. Maybe start that prep work June 1st so you can get out ahead. The other reason I say that, and this is important, I've been around long enough to know, and I'm sure you can recall, Ron, when did regular season wins used to come out? It was Memorial Day weekend over at South Point. They'd release the sheet for all FBS teams. You could go to the window and bet three regular season wins, $500 each, and then get to the back of the line and start over. And now what we've seen is this year and last year in the Power Four leagues, they had regular season wins up for 60 teams 2 weeks after the Super Bowl. And so it's impossible to have those numbers sit for 4 months and then try to jump in and assess value when lines have moved. To the book's credits, I haven't seen much move in the way of the Power Four schools, save for maybe Wake Forest and Kentucky, a half a win here or there. The rest have been some pretty good numbers, or many of the sharp minds aren't necessarily strictly focusing on college football regular season wins at this time. Could be a little bit of both. We also this week had group of 5 regular season wins dropped at some popular shops. So now we have a regular season win total posted on every FBS team. Time to get to work.
Yeah, now I understand that. But even last year, numbers didn't move until mid-July, partly because limits are lower when they first come out, just like in regular week. If you want to bet on a Sunday or Monday, most books, even if they have high limits like Circa and stuff, they're still not going to have their highest limits until 24 hours before the game. And nobody wants to get really squeezed out. And then if you bet a lot of early stuff, I think both of us could probably attest to that. They look at your account and then they say, okay, I think this guy's betting ahead of the game. He's not going to be really recreational in this point of view. We may limit him a little bit more in terms of that. So you really want to have, and plus the other thing, and I know you've said that, we've all said this on shows, line chopping is very important, because why would you want to take the worst of a number? You want to you want to wait till there's 3, 4, 5 different options out there, so you could see how the movement is going and you can compare stuff to one another. And that's another reason why people might wait. But, so there's a lot of moving pieces. They're just moving faster than we've ever had before, because to your point, I don't think if I wanted to wait till July to make a move on a game, that it's going to be there in July to make that move. And even last year, it was there in July and you could still make that move. So it's a very tricky process right now. One thing I want you to comment on, and we talked a little bit about this before we went live, but if you feel like you're listening or watching this and you're saying, my goodness, I'm behind the curve, because you're really not behind the curve in May. There's still things you could do. You could print out team schedules. You can focus on one conference and kind of look at what's going on within a conference. So speak to that, how you might look at any particular team and look at the ebbs and flows, the bye weeks, the long trips, and so on.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think there's really no greater tool when assessing where teams may have trip up spots or where they could trip somebody else up than really deep diving and analyzing the schedule. And these are not necessarily new tricks. We all know what the sandwich spot game is, where a team is off a big game and they have a big game the next week, and right in the middle is this little unimportant game perceived to be classic sandwich spot. We've seen with the complex makeup of 16-team super conferences that the travel is extenuous. You have Washington traveling to Rutgers. You have USC traveling to Minnesota. You have all these different crazy travel spots that are just commonplace now. Rather than once a year, these teams are traveling 2,000 miles or so 3 or 4 times a season. And that really is taxing on your body, and it really is taxing on your mind. And so you also can find, especially at the group of 5 level, you can find teams that could either get beat up in the non-conference, and that could cause some spillover into conference play. Teams that have untimely bye weeks, and so they don't really have a time to exhale for the first 6, 7, 8 weeks of the season. Well, those teams do wear down, and you can find value in games where Team A is a perceived favorite, but they've played 7 straight weeks. Team B is off a bye. Which team is going to exhale? Which team is running out of gas or running on fumes? And you can flip your perception of that one specific game. And sometimes in the regular season win market, that's really all it takes. We talked about this before, but this isn't a Major League Baseball regular season win total of 97.5, where one game doesn't necessarily swing. There's 12 games in the regular season. And if you can find one of those spots where you have now in your own mind, with the analysis that you've done and years to back it up with the research, you can flip a perceived win into a loss that other people may not have identified. That's all the edge you need right there to make a play. And that one win is so critically important. The last thing I'll say is you are so right, and you hit it right on the head about shopping around and having multiple outs. You and I don't need any more hobbies. Our time is already precious. We definitely have some strict financial goals for being a sports bettor, and we're really trying to do this in a way that's fruitful for ourselves. The goal is to win. And one of the quickest and easiest ways that you can do that without anything that requires a lot of talent or research is just get 3, 4, 5 shops and put yourself in the best position to succeed. Get yourself the best number. Get yourself the best odds with the most favorable math in your favor, with the least amount of vig that you're paying, and then shop the inefficiencies in the market as well. As you'll find, once the regular season wins do open up, with inefficiencies in the market, there could be a half a win or a win that you can have a variance. So really assess what that math looks like with the vig and assess what your best option is.
Yeah, and although this isn't necessarily a teaching show in this respect, I can guarantee you, if you keep laying 140 when somebody else is laying 120, that adds up over time. So you should never be involved in that. I want to touch on the what I call the James Madison experiment last year. And that's being, you have one of the two top conferences in the nation right now, the Big Ten. And they brought in a new head coach last year. You could Google him, as he would say. He wins, to use his quote. And Cignetti brought over 9 or 10 starters from James Madison. And on the surface, you say, oh, that's nice. But they played at James Madison. How does that translate to playing against Big Ten competition? And it worked for them somehow, partly because Cignetti's a really good coach. And these players were undervalued or whatever the case may be. That's a really nice story. But there are other stories where the coaching change, more often than not, the coaching change goes south. So as being in my, neck of the woods where 9 out of 10 plays or 8 out of 10 plays are going to be unders, how do you differentiate in terms of looking at a new coach and saying that might work and that might not work?
Generally, you can identify if teams are making stretch hires. I've found at the group of 5 level that when a team is hiring an FCS coach and that coach brings over 12, 14, 20 of their FCS players, generally it does take some time. Cignetti had the benefit of some rock solid JMU teams that had already moved up and had already started recruiting FBS talent. And in that situation with Indiana, it was just clear that the total, or the sum of the total was greater than what is the saying? The sum of the parts is greater than the individual total. Yeah. And so we saw that with the continuity that their team played with for the extensive majority of the season. But you look at other teams where that has happened, like UTEP, where UTEP brought in an FCS head coach from Austin Peay. They brought in 18 FCS players. There was a theory out there that it was boom or bust. Well, it was bust for UTEP. They did not play with offensive continuity. They played fast. They adopted all the systems that they wanted to run, and it just did not work well in year one. It might be a 2 or 3 year rebuild there specifically, but what it creates is high variance. There are some of those lesser known players that have a chip on their shoulder. They were not heavily recruited, and they're certainly playing with fire in their belly, much more than a guy who just bagged a $250,000 NIL deal. And so there is some of that as well. Generally, when I'm focusing in on regular season wins, I may try to avoid those situations when possible because I'm not looking for high variance. I want to hone in and identify consistency with as much consistency as you can get in today's day and age with specific teams. I kind of want the known commodity of what I'm getting, or at least relatively what I'm getting, and then I can go from there and work backwards on what I'm looking at. When you have teams generally that have high roster turnover, new coordinators, new schemes, you could see some pop for the first couple of weeks until you get some film on those players. But generally, those teams don't have as strong of seasons as what would be expected. I think that Texas State and Arizona State and Indiana are the exception to the rule.
Yeah, and Texas State, one of my overplays last year, actually disappointed, losing some games there. So that's what you get when you bet an over. Sometimes you get a little mess up there. I think it bodes to study coaches and study coaches' tendencies. I'm going to give you an example from last year. Maybe you have one from this year. You want to comment on my example. But the coach of San Jose State, I think his name is Brian Brennan. He was a program builder in an era now that you don't build programs. You have to re-recruit your own. And actually this year, Arizona has lost a whole bunch of people to the portal. But he's a program builder. It took him a little while to get San Jose State on the map. And once he did, he had a foundation. With him moving to Arizona, my assessment was if you're a program builder and you're moving to a program, that's going to take longer. That's going to be a rough first year. And I think he had a rough first year, even though he had one of the top wide receivers in all of NCAA last year. And we saw that with the 8th overall pick in the draft in McMillan and a very competent quarterback, that it just didn't go as smoothly when that coach moved over. Any comment on what kind of coach can thrive in the next, because what we talked about, Signetti, he had built other programs before and he built them quickly. He won right away, whereas Brian Brennan did not win right away. Any comment on that?
It's really refreshing to see a coach that's willing to do that and build a program the right way. We saw it with Scott Loeffler and Bowling Green, where the administration had patience with him through some losing seasons. At this point anymore, teams and administration wants instant gratification, and they're not showing the patience. And so coaches are having to pivot in how they recruit and how they build programs, oftentimes doing it what would be considered to be, from the old school guys like you and I, not the right way. And so a lot of those coaches are kind of getting left behind. One place that it's really worked out is Clemson with Dabo Swinney, right? He recruits at a certain level.
Yeah.
They recruit a certain type of athlete, and they recruit on their culture, and they don't use the portal. They have by far the fewest transfers in FBS. I think they had 3 players come in at Clemson, and that is just so far below what everybody else is doing. So not everybody is adopting and embracing the way of the world with the transfer portal. But I'm sad to say it, but I'm here to say it. I think a lot of those coaches are getting left behind, especially if they don't have ADs and people in the administrative sector of the programs that are not willing to show a lot of patience with that. And so you'll see coaches on the hot seat quicker, and people are quick to fire. They're quick to fire and quick to pull the trigger and go in a different direction. So it is concerning, but it is refreshing when you do see a guy that's trying to do it the right way.
Yeah, and it's not just recruiting anymore. It's re-recruiting your own athletes. And I think that is a problem for some of the current head coaches. And it's a shame that it is, but that's the way it seems to be. So let's get into one of your wheelhouse areas, because you've done a lot of work at the, not only we're talking below the group of 5 level now, we're talking about the other level. How did, you said you played at FCS level. How did you get involved with the under the radar schools, and where are your edges there? And my first question is just talk about your love for that.
Surely. Well, I think that you'll find in today's day and age that the NIL and the transfer portal and a lot of the things that have changed with college football that would be considered by old school thinking people like you and I, those are perceived to be bad and negative for the overall totality of the sport. The FCS does avoid a lot of that. They just don't have a lot of the lack of continuity and the consistency and people shuffling around. And so I can really appreciate that. But back in about 2012, we would start to see lines, limited availability, but you'd start to see lines on games involving FBS and FCS competition that were widely available. And then you just started to see some FCS lines. And so I just tried to find value wherever I could in the smaller college leagues. I think one downfall of a lot of novice bettors is that they're there to bet the big game, Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Georgia. They're there to bet those big premier marquee games. But I'm here to tell you, money won on South Dakota State or Middle Tennessee State, that money spends just as well. And so I found inefficiency in those markets. It's so hard. If you kind of pivot and take a step towards NCAA basketball, when there's 363 teams and there's 31 conferences, it is hard for the books to get a grasp and an identity on all of those teams. Well, that's really what we see with FCS. There's so much information that they just maybe don't put as much weighting on, and they focus on the Power 4 and the marquee teams, the top 25 teams, and now the group of 5 as well. But there's just so much more inefficiency in those markets, and it is easier to identify spots where teams struggle, especially in rivalry situations or travel. The other thing that you'll find in FCS football is there's no greater gap at any level than that of the top tier teams in FCS. We're talking South Dakota State, Montana State, North Dakota State Bison, that sort of talent compared to the absolute very bottom of FCS, which would be your SWAC and MEAC competition, and then the Pioneer Football League, which is it's an FCS non-scholarship league, and those teams include Marist, Butler, Davidson, Stetson, University of San Diego. Those teams are non-scholarship FCS participants. Those players are not receiving tuition money to be there. They're paying their own way. Well, what athlete are you recruiting in that situation? A lot of those non-scholarship teams are power rated about middle of the road Division II level. And so you find that gap is very, very wide. When those teams travel, and there is some collecting a check to fund the program, when those teams travel and play some of those top tier FCS programs, they can't set those spreads high enough. 35, 37, 39, it's just not high enough. And so I've really identified the inefficiencies there. It's really a fun league, right? It's a fun level of football. I love the Ivy League, and I know you've spent some time cutting your teeth on the Ivy League as well. And it really allows you to really stay sharp in your betting activity and in your week-to-week preparation repertoire as well when you're seeking value in those smaller conferences.
Yeah, so my story, as I've told many a time, is I started with the Ivy League because I couldn't believe a school could ever be a 40-point underdog every week. So I kept taking them, and I realized they can be a 40-point underdog every week. There is a reason for that. But then I started honing in my line of scrimmage stuff, and the Ivy League was perfect for me. And if there's any silver lining to COVID, when all these schools weren't sure whether they were playing or not playing, or whether I decided, okay, let me get back into the Ivy League. And it is a side thing that I've been doing. I started with the Ivy League, and probably by next year, I'll just be ending with the Ivy League, just doing them, and stuff like that. So I love the Ivy League. What advice would you give to somebody who said, something, I'm tired of realignment. I don't want to worry about Georgia and Alabama. Everybody knows anything. Everybody knows everything there. What advice would you give to somebody who says, yeah, I want to bet the MEAC and stuff like that? How do I go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing you can do is try to find a conference where you could have some sort of regional familiarity. Where do you live? If you live in the Southeast, look at the SoCon or look at the Colonial Athletic Association or some of those. If you live in the Northeast, the NEC is a great conference to focus on, along with the Ancient Eight. And so you can try to find a little bit more easily accessible information based geographically on where you live. And for someone starting out in FCS, don't try to tackle it all. You can focus on some of the premier leagues, because you'll find in the Missouri Valley Conference and in the Big Sky, there's a lot of good football that's being played there. It's fun football. It's competitive football. And so if you really just try to focus on 2 or 3 leagues, you can still deep dive the rosters. You can still analyze the schedule. It'll take a little bit of kind of reframing your mind on what teams are what. When you see teams like Lindenwood or Mercyhurst that come up on the schedule, you have to double take and say, whoa, what the heck is that? But once you can start to get a baseline for where teams are at season to season, by about year 2 or 3, you should be able to start to feel like you're making progress at that level.
Yeah. That kind of hones into one more question before we get into some quick hitters, and that's the whole concept of power ratings by itself. Not everybody sets power ratings. People do things different ways, or they could use widely available power ratings. I think you set power ratings, if I'm correct, and I've set them, and I really haven't had to change my process for how I adjust power ratings for over 40 years. To be honest, I back tested it for 3 years before I used it, because you can't just say, oh, I'm going to set power ratings and then do it and think you're going to be an expert on it. I mean, I studied this thing for 3 years before I put it into place, and now they've been in place forever. So last year a little bit, and this year it's kind of, we get back to where we started. There's so much change with all these rosters. I'm worrying, and I mentioned this to Kyle a couple weeks ago when he was on with me, that we don't know how good a team might be week 1. They may be a completely different team week 4, because they're trying to figure out how these 5 new offensive linemen are going to bond with each other. Because really, when you have a whole group of athletes that are new, they have to learn what each other is doing. The strong safety needs to know where the cornerback is. The right guard needs to know where the right tackle is and stuff like that. And we may have some hidden value, or we may say, oh, I overestimated a team. That's a long-winded way of saying that I don't know if I need to have more volatility in my week 1 to week 2 adjustment of power ratings, and I have to go outside my comfort zone in adjusting power ratings the first couple weeks of the season. Is that fair? Is that something you might be wrestling with? Where do you stand on that issue?
I think it's fair, and there's no greater disparity that I've ever seen in power ratings than from season to season. You can have a team that's power rated 14 points better than last year's team or 14 points worse, depending on the transfer portal activity. So you do have to have the intestinal fortitude to make those adjustments when you start your season. I always try to err on the side of not making knee-jerk reactions and not adjusting my numbers too frequently.
Mm-hmm.
But at times I've had to do so. Otherwise, what happens? Well, the model becomes obsolete and it becomes ineffective. And so I think that you have to carefully balance trying to not make knee-jerk reactions with trying to accurately assess what your eyeballs are telling you when you're watching all of these football games every Saturday afternoon and Friday night and Thursday night. And you really have to trust your instincts on what you've seen over years and years of doing this, assess the talent and the play that you see on the field. You've got to be willing to make the adjustments, but you're just kind of hoping that it's not too knee-jerk. It's really an art. It's really an art.
It is an art.
It takes a feel for the spreadsheet. It takes a feel for seeing what you're doing, and you kind of just gotta have that third element, which is just right there in the gut.
And I will caution people who are saying, oh, power ratings are the be all end all. I've used them for 40 some years, but it's only 1/3 of my handicapping process. It's matchup analysis, who controls the line of scrimmage, how that works, and situational factors, as we've talked about with the new coaches, the bye weeks, the travel, revenge games, whatever the case may be, not this, that, and the other. So it's a balancing of all three. You don't want to go completely against your power ratings, but if it matches some of the other analysis that you've done, then it kind of works. And I've seen, you get an example of where you might start. It's so hard for me to start a team 14 or 18 points different than what they ended last year. It's so counterintuitive to what I've been doing all these years, but the game has changed. I don't think I've ever changed an Iowa power rating more than 3 points in the history of Iowa power ratings, because Iowa is the same thing every year, the same offense that puts you to sleep and the same Phil Parker coach defense that wakes you up. I've never changed anything. And then last year we saw Florida State where, the roof caved in and there was no way you could set a power number low enough. So we've got extremes now, Josh, and it's crazy.
It is crazy, and I think it's really wise, something that you said. It's good to adhere to power ratings and to use them as part of your handicap, but it is far from the end-all be-all, and I would not put all of my eggs in the power ratings basket. I think there are so many different things that you can analyze: the situational matchups, coaching tendencies, the Willies and the Joes that are on the field, and how those matchups between Team A and Team B are actually going to play out. The advanced metrics, and even simple counting stats are so important. What does a team do for tackles for loss? What's their stuff rate? What's their sack? Do they get in the backfield and create havoc? How does a team perform on third down? How do they convert in the red zone? Special teams metrics, some of those simple counting stats. I still believe in the power of some of those numbers. If a team is terrible on third down and they kick field goals in the red zone, well, there's a reason why. Let's dive a little deeper, but those numbers are really valuable.
Yeah, a lot of different nuances there in terms of 3rd and 1, are they in shotgun, all kinds of strange things that way. Let's give the folks a little bit of 2025 quick hitters, random teams, random thoughts. First one, obviously the Bill Belichick one. North Carolina, easy to handicap or hard to handicap?
Hard, I think. He's an NFL coach. He's always managed NFL type of games. You see the second half of NFL games managed so much differently than what usual college football second halves are managed. So if we see that early in the season, we might be able to get out ahead of it. But the thing is, too, Bill Belichick widely regarded as one of the top NFL coaches of all time. He was coaching grown men who were being paid at their job to be there, and now he's coaching 18 to 22-year-old kids. Is he going to get frustrated with the lack of execution? Is the team going to show signs of being less disciplined than the New England Patriots were? And does he get frustrated with that? How does he manage the mind of these 18 to 22-year-old kids? And how do you adjudicate discipline and coaching and correction, putting your arm around these kids, all these hats that college coaches have to wear, as opposed to NFL coaches, which can rule with an iron fist and say, if you don't like it, there's the door. And by the way, return the money. We'll get somebody else. I mean, some of that, there's a little bit of leash with some star players, but at the end of the day, there's so much control in the NFL about what your team does Monday through Saturday. I don't think he's going to have a lot of that control that he's used to. So I'll be interested to see how frustrated he gets. And I think he is likely to maximize the talent on the field that he gets early, but it'll be real interesting this season to see how that plays out from the mental standpoint with how he's managing 18 to 22-year-old kids.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating watch to see what happens. I could see him as the old defensive secondary type mentality. I mean, he had those secondaries play against elite quarterbacks and really stuff them. If you have an average or below average quarterback and Bill Belichick has 2 weeks, for example, to prepare, that quarterback's toast. I don't think he's going to do anything. But on the flip side, has he ever coached athletes that have to deal with a spread offense in a certain way with speed base? Are they going to stay disciplined in their lanes in different spots? Is he going to implement a passing offense where there's no passing offense? There's so many moving parts. It's going to be a fascinating watch. Penn State will win the
point up as well. I'm glad you brought that point up as well, because the NFL has largely been regarded as a copycat league. The teams run the same 60 plays, and it comes down to execution and who makes the play. It's real interesting with the different schemes offensively and defensively and how he's willing to adapt to that.
Yeah. Number 2, Penn State wins the Big Ten. Yes or no?
Gun to my head right now, I would say yes. I think they're in a pretty decent position with what they have coming back. I think the schedule lines up fairly favorable for them. They have a super easy breezy non-conference, and then they really it's a little bit of home payback maybe with Oregon with how that Big Ten championship game went. I think they'll have just as good of a say in who wins it as anyone else in that Big Three with Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State. So sure, I'll say that they will at this point.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that camp as well. Boy, those guys, to get their entire backfield back was amazing. Obviously, that's part of the big boys with money and not so big boys without money to be able to keep them. If I'm a running back, I'd rather go to the NFL because you get used up. But hey, congratulations for keeping them. That's a loaded roster. Tougher one, Mississippi will win the SEC.
I'm not saying they can't. I'll say no now. I haven't made a play on them. I think they have 2 unique landmines, and that would be hosting LSU, and then their travel game, one of their travel games at Oklahoma, I think will provide some interesting challenges for them as well. And the SEC week in and week out, I think there's about 6 different teams that could compete for the SEC title when it's all said and done. You've got the usual suspects in Texas, Alabama, and Georgia. There's some theory out there that LSU is going to reload and rebuild. I think Ole Miss will be okay. Just so much talent in that league, and really teams 1 through 11, if they're at home, if the atmosphere is right, I mean, any one of those teams could pull an upset. And then you throw a team like Vandy in there that's no longer an automatic bye.
No.
And you really have to focus in, hone in on, and prep for teams like Vanderbilt and South Carolina. Florida, there's a perception that they're possibly going to be even a little bit better than they were last year. So toughest of the Power Four leagues to predict, in my opinion, is the SEC because of the influx in talent top to bottom. So just because I don't have a strong position and I have no play on it there, I'll say no.
Yeah, I thought they could be in the 12-team playoff last year. They threw in a clunker, I think, against Kentucky. They were in a terrible scheduling spot against LSU last year, even worse than this year's spot. So and they came up big as I expected against Georgia, but it wasn't enough. So it'll be interesting. I don't recall who their starting quarterback might be this year? Maybe before we leave that, do you have any thoughts? Do you remember who their starting quarterback is? Obviously, they had Jackson Dart last year, and that was part of the reason with that experience and him being second year in the program that I thought that would carry over. He had a couple of bad games and a lot of good games.
Let me pull it up here for you real quick.
Yeah. Put you on the spot there, but I was just thinking, let's not leave Ole Miss without talking about who is their quarterback.
Yeah, I just had that pulled up too. I'll get it here for you.
Okay. I'm going to be asking you about Notre Dame and Michigan as well. Yeah, I might be, well, no, I can't pull it up right now, but on our lads, they have the depth chart and can get it there.
Yeah, we've got Austin Simmons, who's a redshirt sophomore. I think he actually backed up last year, so I think they're going to rely on him. They brought in another couple of transfers that I don't know that are going to compete for the job. So
okay, so we have an
Simmons.
unknown right now. Okay, so that'll be interesting for Lane Kiffin's group. Okay, good to know. Notre Dame and Michigan, I think they'll struggle to win 9 games. Thoughts?
Yeah, I generally think that that's the case as well. I think Notre Dame has too many questions, save for offensive line is probably shored up okay, and I think the running back room will be decent again. But who's going to quarterback Notre Dame? I just don't know necessarily if they have that important position really shored up, and if they feel confident in C.J. Carr to be able to do it at the level that Riley Leonard did last year. So just with what I have assessed so far specific to Notre Dame, yeah, I think it will probably be a little bit more difficult for them. I think the regular season win is 9.5, and I would lean under. But yeah, it'll be a struggle for them to surpass 9. Michigan.
And I like their coach.
Yeah, Marcus Freeman's a very good coach, good motivator, and really humble and really connects with his players. I think he does a really good job there, in my opinion. Going to Michigan specifically, which you had asked about here just a minute ago. You know, they had such a disappointing season, but they really ramped it up the last couple of games of the year when they had beaten Ohio State and then they beat Alabama in the bowl game. So it's definitely something to build towards. I'm just going through the schedule here. At Oklahoma will certainly provide a challenge. I think at Nebraska will be a tougher game than many might expect. And so there's a landmine there. They got to go to the West Coast to USC, which could also potentially provide some challenges. And then, you know, they host Ohio State at the end of the season. The preseason line on that is already Ohio State -5, 5.5. So, you know, the Big Ten is one of those leagues that's just riddled with teams that are mediocre in the back half of the league. And you've got teams like Maryland, Northwestern, Purdue, Michigan State, Washington. So there is a thought that they could possibly get on a run there. And the non-conference is manageable except for that week 2 road game against Oklahoma. So I'd say if they get better quarterback play, which they're projecting that they will, I think that they could probably be okay. Wisconsin is likely to be down this year. I don't love everything Washington's doing. Certainly probably one of those teams that we had talked about before that'll just be buried in that 7th or 8th spot in the Big Ten forever. Based on how the schedule lines up, I think if they can avoid catastrophe at either Nebraska or at USC, yeah, I think they'll win 9.
I love the way that they play hard for the coach, and he's one of those trenches guys. You can just see it, you know, the way they play. I really do not like his offensive creativity, and that's my issue with them. Is that if you have the kind of team that can slow them down in the trenches, they just seem to be one of those teams that prefers to go run, pass, and I think a little more creativity because they get the athletes. If we start to see that, I think, why can't they win 9 or more? But if we don't see that, they may play in a few more close games than expected. Then it comes down to the kicking game, and then we evaluate the kicking game. And please, if you're handicapping games, evaluate the kicking game because it's that important. One more quick hitter, surprise playoff team.
LSU.
Okay.
They'll finish third in the SEC and they'll get in.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll have, if Notre Dame does not make the 12-team playoff, then you've got 4 from the Big Ten and 4 from the SEC. You've definitely got 8 of the 12 spots locked up because you're not going to get more than 3 from the ACC and the Big 12. At least that's what it appears to be right now. I could be wrong on that, but we'll see in terms of that. LSU seems to recruit a lot of good talent all the time. They weren't hit that much by the NFL. I mean, not a lot of great players went to the NFL, and that's one of the benchmarks that I look. Not just, okay, you have some people drafted to the NFL, but if you're LSU and you don't have first, second, and third rounders drafted to the NFL, then you're not going to lose much talent. So it's an interesting thought there. I'm kind of fresh out of questions. Is there anything else you want to add or close with here?
I think it's been a great program. We've given everyone a lot of information. It's time to dive in and get to work on those regular season wins. I look forward to you and I collaborating there and providing some good, actionable content for your listeners. Be on the lookout for some regular season win unders. I had mentioned this before, but over 12 successful years of regular season wins and hitting 71% over that time, 90% of my plays, 90% minimum, are on the under. There's a lot of value in regular season win unders. And so you and I are both in that camp, and we'll be pushing out some plays soon for that. So I'd say for people to stay tuned on that. And Ron, I look forward to collaborating with you more and more as we get closer to the season and also throughout the season. I love the prep work that you put in. I love your process. I really appreciate the thoroughness of what you're looking at and the analytics that you have and the reasoning behind your plays. I think you definitely do things the right way.
I appreciate that. My last question was going to be talk me off the ledge, and I say that for a reason editorially here is that I really enjoy putting together the previews that I do. It's 80 pages worth of previews, 134 teams. Last year, I loved putting together 133 out of the 134 teams. The 134th team that I put together, I was disgusted, but that's a different story. But the story really here is that I was teetering in terms of whether or not to do it, but I really because I care about the field, the handicapping field, I really like that people like yourself are out there to carry the torch for the next generation, to show people and are willing. This is the key point, that you are willing to show people how to dig in and how to do process handicapping. It's not this fly-by-night thing. What do you like? What do you like? What do you think here? It's you have the foundation. And that's what I like moving forward. I think the industry is in good hands if we have more Joshuas in the industry. And so I thank you for participating in this podcast. One more thing is where are people going to see you and see your work so that they can understand where you're going from, what you're going to give them, what kind of content even before the season starts?
Well, I definitely appreciate all the kind words. It's very humbling to hear from you. I appreciate that. I am a writer for the Action Network, and so I write up about 10 to 12 games weekly for the Action Network. I'm also appearing on some other media mediums to include some of the YouTube content that they have, along with the podcasts, which you can find on Apple or Spotify. I'm participating in other podcasts throughout the season with our friend Kyle Hunter. There'll be more to come on that. We'll certainly do some collaboration together, you and me, and very active in the gambling forums. So covers.com, cappingthegame.com, the RX forum, you can find me there, and active on Twitter at StepOnADuck. And so please feel free to reach out anytime. I love the conversation and happy to answer any questions people have.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on. And I want to say thank you to every single one of my guests on the 12 podcasts. I get to pick them individually, some that I never had on podcasts before, different perspectives, different journeys. I just wanted to keep involved in terms of the spring. We covered nitty-gritty topics like the draft, but we also talked about other concepts and processes along the way. Only 2 or 3 of the shows covered NCAA football. This one in the most detail of NCAA football. I will be mostly disappearing until August, just to let the audience know. I'll appear occasionally as a guest on a few shows. I'm happy to appear as a guest, but I'm also happy to go to the traveling that my wife and I are going to be doing, and the joyous events that we are going to be soon having, as soon as 2 days from now. So we're very happy. I'll be reading about NCAA. I'm not going away from a study standpoint. You can't really leave the handicapping world. But thanks to everybody who's tuned in to the shows. If you've missed any of them, you can see my bio on X and rediscover them. A lot of them are kind of foundation process driven. So thanks to everybody who's joined me on this journey. See you back before the start of next season, and back with Las Vegas Chris and others, maybe Kyle, maybe Josh as well. So thanks again, and have a great rest of spring and summer.